right. We're ready for chapter 11.
I'm a burrito.
Rosian's in her burrito tortilla blanket.
And I'm going to bed.
And I'm in my star hoodie.
I'm so
Hoodie.
tired.
Who's all watching these videos anyways, huh?
Hello, whoever's watching this.
All right.
I cleaned a building today.
She did. She helped me clean my building tonight.
I vacuumed.
Okay. Chapter 11 is
like
on.
Felt like I was exercising, like, pulling that vacuum.
All right. Chapter 11, page 129, The Luckiest Man Alive. Each week, Dr. Medhurst held a prayer meeting in his home. Hudson regularly attended the meeting, as did William Burns, a Presbyterian minister from England, who had made several trips inland with Hudson. On one particular cold wintry night, Captain Bowers, captain of the Geelong, a coastal sailing ship that serviced the treaty ports dotted up and down the coast of China, was attending the prayer meeting. He asked for prayer for the city of Swatow, 800 miles to the south. 800 miles.
Wow.
That'd be like from here to Denver, but a little further, okay?
Sioux Falls to Denver.
Yeah. 800 miles.
Wowzers.
To the south. The captain had just come from there and could not forget the awful things he'd seen. Swatow was not a treaty port, but there were many foreigners living there. Most were traders of opium, slaves, and prostitutes. Captain Bowers wanted the group to pray that a missionary would feel called there. Hudson couldn't get out of his mind all Captain Bowers had said about Swatow. He felt sure God was calling him to go. There was just one problem. He and William Burns had become close friends. Hudson hated the idea of leaving his friend. Indeed, they had become a very effective team, ministering together. But despite his personal feelings, Hudson had to obey God. So he went to tell William Burns his decision. When Hudson finally said he was leaving, the big smile spread across William Burns' face. That very evening, he had been going to tell Hudson exactly the same thing. God had called him to Swatow as well. In March 1856, with free passage on the Geelong, the two men set out on their journey south. The ship stayed close to the coastline, and as they got farther south, they could see the plants and trees become more and more tropical. Apple trees were replaced by banana trees, and the fertile river plain that surrounded Shanghai slowly became steep mountains, whose sides had been terraced to grow rice. Silt and mud gave way to long, white sandy beaches. It was all so warm and bright and lush compared to Shanghai in winter. In Swatow, the two men rented an attic room above the incense shop. It was a big room that ran the length of the store. To get to it, they had to climb a ladder propped behind the counter. There was no trapdoor to the room, and someone in the shop was curious about what the foreign devils were doing, they just climbed the ladder and looked in. Hudson learned some of the local dialect, and before long, he was preaching in the streets. He and William Burns also set up a small medical clinic. Soon, the clinic was bustling with people. Hudson did his best to meet their needs, but he had left most of his medicines, surgical equipment, and books back in Shanghai. For the clinic to be more effective, it was decided that Hudson should make an extended trip back to Shanghai and collect his things. Someone in Shanghai could have saved him the trip if he had been told that the fire in the London Missionary Society storehouse had destroyed all his medical supplies. But since no one had ever written him, it was a great shock to Hudson when he reached Shanghai. Although discouraged and frustrated by what had happened to his belongings, he decided that after traveling 800 miles, he was not going to return empty-handed. So he set out for Ningpo to see if Dr. Parker had any spare supplies. When he arrived, he found the new hospital nearly finished. Glad to see him, Dr. Parker asked Hudson to help him get things organized. There was much to do. Hudson decided the experience would be useful to him when he returned to Swatow. It was 2 months before everything was organized. Hudson felt great satisfaction as the new hospital opened and began ministering to the medical needs of the local population. The 2 months had also given him a good opportunity to get to know John Jones and his wife Mary, who were the latest missionaries to the Chinese Evangelization Society and sent to China. John Jones and Hudson became good friends. They made several short trips together to some of the outlying settlements around Ningpo to preach the gospel and distribute tracts and Bibles. Hudson made another friendship during his 2 months in Ningpo. Every Wednesday evening, the Parkers had dinner with Miss Aldersey and the Dyer sisters. At 60 years of age, Miss Aldersey was a formidable woman. She had been in China a long time and had single-handedly established a large school and orphanage, the first of its kind, to be opened in China by Protestants. When Miss Aldersey made up her mind about something, there was no going back. She decided once that an early morning walk was good for her health, so at exactly 5 a.m. every morning, she could be seen walking around the city wall. If it snowed, she wore more clothes. If it was dark or foggy, a servant walked in front of her carrying a lantern. Nothing got in the way of her morning walk. Many Chinese people found it difficult to imagine the mighty British Empire being run by a woman, Queen Victoria. Long live the Queen. Those who knew Miss Aldersey did not find it strange at all. The Dyer sisters, 21-year-old Brunella and 19-year-old Maria, came to be in Ningpo through a very roundabout set of circumstances. The girls had been born in Singapore, where their parents were early missionaries with the London Missionary Society. When their father died, their mother married Mr. Bosum. He became the girls' stepfather. Not long after their mother died and Mr. Bosum remarried, the girls continued to live with him and his new wife. Several years later, Mr. Bosum also died. After his death, the girls' Uncle William Tarn, who lived in London, became their guardian. He paid for their education, but the girls remained close to Mrs. Bosum, who, even though she had not known either of their parents, was like a mother to them. Since she was getting on in age, Mr. Aldersey had asked Mr. Bosum to come to China and prepare to take over the management of the orphanage and school from her. Brunella and Maria agreed to go with her to China. That was how both girls had come to be living in Ningpo. During the time the girls had been in Ningpo, Miss Aldersey had given more and more of the control of the orphanage and school over to Mrs. Bosum, and having more spare time on her hands, she had been taking more and more control over what Maria and Brunella did. Brunella. What a name. Brunella?
Sounds like a name.
In her mind, they were fragile young women in a land where men might take advantage of them. They had to be protected, and she was going to do it. For that reason, Miss Aldersey was not pleased when Dr. Parker asked if he could bring Hudson along to dinner at her house. She could have said no, but that would have been bad manners. Yet to her, Hudson Taylor was an embarrassment to have around. He was short, had dyed hair and a ridiculous queue, and wore threadbare Chinese clothes. Really? She asked the girls one evening after he had left the house. Does he have no pride in being British? For his part, Hudson, that's okay. Hudson enjoyed the evenings at Mr. Aldersey's. Brunella and Maria both sang beautifully, and the food was always English, reminding him of his mother's cooking. He was completely unaware, though, of the effect he was having on one of the two sisters. While Miss Aldersey disliked Hudson more and more with each visit, tall, slim, brown-haired Maria saw him as more exciting and daring than anyone she had ever met. I have to start is plug it in. It's going to die. This might be the way you get the video on the side. Does that still work?
No. You have to tilt the phone.
Are you sure?
You have to tilt the phone to watch it. But nobody's really going to watch it, just listening. Right, guys?
All right, let's see.
Uh-oh. Blast your page.
All right. Anyways, let's try this. Once the hospital was up and running, Hudson prepared to return to Swatow and his work with William Burns. Dr. Parker gave him as much medicine and equipment as he could spare, and Hudson set out for Shanghai, where another ship would take him down the coast to Swatow. When he got to Shanghai, there was an urgent letter waiting for him from William Burns. Burns had decided to take a trip inland from Swatow. In the course of the journey, he and his 2 servants had been arrested by Chinese authorities and put in jail in Canton. Eventually, he had been freed. Turned over to the British Council. But now the British Council had forbidden them to return to Swatow and continue their work there. So there was no point in Hudson's returning. Hudson was stunned. It had taken him 3 months to travel and work to get the medicine and equipment he needed for his clinic there. Besides, he enjoyed the work in Swatow. He had looked forward to getting back there. There was so much to do, so many needs, both medical and spiritual, to be ministered to. What would happen to the people of Swatow without them? As he thought about the situation, he decided he had 2 options. While he waited to see if things changed in Swatow so that he could go back, he could either stay on in Shanghai or go back to the Ningpo and work with Dr. Parker. He decided on going back to Ningpo. Dr. Parker welcomed him back. Hudson moved into the house on the bridge street, named for the bridge at each end of the street. Dr. Parker used the house as the school, but the attic was too cold for the children. That was where Hudson slept. On very cold winter mornings, it wasn't unusual for him to wake up and find a thin layer of snow on top of his quilt that had drifted in through the cracks of the tile roof. Sounds like fun. Okay.
Remember when I was 3 and you filled the bathtub with snow because it was too cold outside?
Yeah. Hudson fit right back into work at the hospital with Dr. Parker. Ooh. I'm falling into the couch, guys. Oh. I got safely out of the couch. Okay.
Eugene is enjoying her pickles.
Oh, pickles at 11 o'clock at night, for real. Yes, it is about 11. The weeks quickly rolled by, and soon it was Christmas. Everyone tried. Did I read that? Hudson fit right back into work at the hospital with Dr. Parker and with John Jones. He also continued to preach in and around Ningpo. The weeks quickly rolled by, and soon it was Christmas. Everyone tried to have fun because in the back of everyone's mind was the thought that this could be the last Christmas spent together in Ningpo. Even as they danced and sang, the threat of another opium war was never far from their thoughts. The latest situation... The latest situation had started when the Arrow, which was actually a Chinese ship flying the British flag, was boarded and opium was found. The Arrow's crew was dragged off and imprisoned by Chinese officials. The British were furious. How dare Chinese officials board a ship flying the Union Jack? Actually, the Chinese had every right to board the ship, since the Arrow had no right to be flying the British flag in the first place. The British, though, didn't worry too much about that. To them, it was the Chinese trying to interfere with their trade again, and it had to stop. The British demanded an immediate apology or they would bomb Canton. I'll eat your pickles further away.
Okay.
When the Chinese didn't apologize, the British lit their cannons and bombarded the city. Many foreigners, including Hudson, sided with the Chinese point of view. The British needed to remember that they were guests in a foreign country. But to the Chinese, all foreigners were the same. Some Chinese groups even offered to pay a bounty, oh boy, for the head of every foreign devil brought to them. This put all foreigners in China in a very difficult position. In Hong Kong, a baker put arsenic in his bread and sold the loaves only to foreigners. Thankfully, he didn't use quite enough arsenic, and while people got sick from eating the bread, no one died. In Ningpo itself, a group of Portuguese merchants were attacked and killed. Many missionaries were beginning to think they should leave Ningpo. China didn't seem to be a safe place anymore. The missionaries knew they were most likely to be attacked when they were all in one group, but they continued to meet for church and prayer meetings anyway. What they didn't know was that a band of angry Chinese men had asked the local magistrate for permission to kill all the missionaries in Ningpo. The magistrate had given his permission, and all that remained was to wait for the missionaries to gather for the church on Sunday. Kind of like Esther, when Haman he asked the king to kill all the Jews, not knowing Esther was a Jew herself. Plot twist. It was arranged that the largest group of men would attack the church service, while a smaller group would round up and kill any missionary who wasn't at the church. One of the men planning the attack had a friend who worked for a missionary. He knew that when they carried out their plan, his friend might well be killed, along with the foreigners, so he warned him of the attack. The man then told the missionary that employed him about the plan. News spread quickly about the missionaries. They decided to pray about the situation and called a special prayer meeting. At the same time, a junior mandarin heard about the plan to kill the missionaries and went to the magistrate. He pointed out that if all the missionaries in the city were killed, it would anger foreigners so much that Ningpo would be attacked just as Canton had been. He pointed out that the British had the power to kill every Chinese person in Ningpo and level every building in return for the attack. The magistrate had not thought about this, and when he did, it scared him. He quickly sent out an order canceling the attack. The prayers of the missionaries had been answered, but even though their lives had been spared this time, things were still very tense in Ningpo. Some missionaries hired bodyguards, but what was to stop the bodyguards from killing the missionaries? Finally, it was decided that the women and the children should go back to Shanghai and wait there until things settled down in Ningpo. Hudson and John Jones were asked to escort them. The Dyer sisters, though, refused to go. They felt they needed to stay behind and help Mrs. Bossum keep the orphanage and school open. 2 boats were hired to take the women and children to Shanghai. As they sailed up the Grand Canal away from Ningpo, Hudson had the strangest thought. He wondered whether he would ever see Maria again. Does he love her? Back in Shanghai, he couldn't get Maria out of his mind. So finally, he wrote a letter to her and asked her if she would be willing to get to know him better, with the possibility that they might one day get married. Maria was thrilled to get Hudson's letter. She hadn't even been sure he knew she cared about him. But her joy was over when she told Miss Aldersey about the letter. Miss Aldersey was shocked. How dare Hudson Taylor, that silly little man parading himself around like a Chinaman, think he should marry one of her girls? He could barely support himself. What hope did he have to supporting Maria or making her happy? Such a marriage would be an embarrassment. It was unthinkable, and she was going to make sure it never happened. She immediately wrote a letter to Mr. Maria's uncle and guardian in London, and warned him that some undesirable missionary had fallen in love with his niece. Having written that letter, she called Maria into her study and made her write a letter telling Hudson she did not want to marry him and asking him never to mention the subject again. Hudson was disappointed by Maria's letter, but even he'd begun to wonder exactly what he had to offer a wife. He put the letter aside and turned his attention to another troubling matter. Since being in Shanghai, Hudson and John Jones had discovered that the Chinese Evangelization Society was borrowing the money they were sending to their missionaries. This worried both men. Hudson did not believe in borrowing for himself, and he found it difficult to accept someone else borrowing for him. He and John Jones prayed about what they should do. Finally, they both decided they should resign from the Chinese Evangelization Society. Hudson now had no missionary society backing him and no other source of income. He was alone and was relying on God to meet all his needs, just as he had done in Hull and London. While in Shanghai, Hudson also thought a lot about the challenge foreign missionaries faced in China, and where was I? I'll just start here. While in Shanghai, Hudson also thought a lot about the challenge foreign missionaries faced in China, and he came to a conclusion. China was not going to be reached with the gospel if the job was left to foreigners alone. There were too many difficulties to be overcome. The best thing for foreigners to do was train Chinese people to take the gospel deep into China to their own people. Hudson shared his insight with John Jones, and the two of them decided that when they got back to Ningpo, they would throw their energy into starting a church in the house on Bridge Street, where they could train up Chinese Christians to go and share the gospel. After 2 months in Shanghai, the situation in Ningpo settled down, and the women and children were able to return. After he got back, Hudson would sometimes see Maria at a friend's house, but they did not speak to each other more than they had to. But as he continued to think about things with Maria, Hudson wondered if Miss Aldersey might be at the bottom of Maria's letter of rejection. So he decided to pay her a visit. Bum, bum, bum. It was not a pleasant visit, but he did find out that she had made Maria write the letter to him. He also found out a few other things. Miss Aldersey made it very clear to him that she did not think he was fit to ask anyone to be his wife. Her comments reminded him of the letter from Mary Ann's father 3 years earlier. After his visit, things got worse for him. Miss Aldersey started rumors around the community about Hudson. But despite her efforts, Hudson would not give up. He had to know how Maria felt about him. Sorry, I do not know how to edit YouTube videos. The opportunity to ask her came not long. He had to know how Maria felt about him. The opportunity to ask her came not long afterwards when there was a women's prayer meeting at the Bridge Street Church. Hudson had gone out for the evening so as not to disturb the women. When he returned, he saw that not all the women had left. His heart beat faster. He opened the door, and sure enough, Maria was still there, sitting by the window. Mrs. Bowsum sat beside her, but Miss Aldersey had already left. This was Hudson's chance. He asked Mrs. Bowsum if he could talk with Maria, and soon the three of them were alone in one of the upstairs rooms. Hudson pretended Mrs. Bowsum was not there, as he told Maria that he loved her. Maria smiled and nodded. She loved Hudson too. Within minutes, things were settled. Hudson would write to Mr. Tarn and ask his permission to marry Maria. When Mrs. Aldersey found out that Maria and Hudson had met and talked together, she was furious. She wrote Hudson a rude letter, telling him he ought to be ashamed to call himself a Christian, going around luring young missionary girls who did not know any better. But all her ranting did no good. Mr. Tarn wrote back and gave his permission for Hudson and Maria to be married, and so they were. On January 20th, 1858, 1 year after Hudson had taken the women and children away from Ningpo to safety in Shanghai, he was standing at the front of the church with Maria, who wore a gray silk dress with a long wedding veil. He himself had freshly dyed his queue, his little ponytail, and bought a new suit of Chinese clothes for the wedding. As he stood at the front of the church, he felt that he was the luckiest man alive to have such a beautiful bride. Hudson and Maria had their honeymoon in a wonderful old monastery in the hills overlooking Ningpo. They were very happy together. Unfortunately, after only 2 weeks of marriage, Maria became very ill. She had typhoid, a disease that was often deadly. Hudson took care of her, but just as she was beginning to get better, Hudson came down with the disease himself. Mr. Bowsum kindly looked after them both, and it was April before Hudson and Maria were well enough to move into the Bridge Street house together. Indeed, it would be many years before Hudson was completely well again. Years? A year went by, and Hudson continued to work hard at establishing a church in the Bridge Street house, while Maria opened small school for girls. Those were happy times for Hudson. And Maria.
These so late at night.
But during the second year of their marriage, some changes took place. In July, a baby daughter was born. They named her Grace Dyer Taylor. She was a pretty little girl, and everyone loved to make her laugh. The next change was a sad one. In August, Dr. Parker's wife became ill with cholera and died within 2 days. Everyone was stunned by her sudden death, and Dr. Parker was too upset to go on with his medical work. He decided to take their 4 children back to Scotland, where his parents could help him raise them. But who would run the hospital he had labored so hard to establish? There was no other qualified doctor in all of Ningpo to take it over. The hospital would have to close, but what about the dispensary? Here all eyes fell on Hudson. It wasn't possible for him to keep it open. Hudson protested. Dr. Parker treated private foreign patients to make money to keep the hospital and dispensary open. Since Hudson was not a qualified doctor, he couldn't do that. Still, he agreed to consider it, and he and Maria fasted and prayed. After several days, Hudson felt that he should take over not only the dispensary, but also the hospital. Somehow, with God's help, they would make it work. Dr. Parker left them with enough money to run the hospital for a month, and then 8 days after burying his wife, he left for Scotland. The hospital turned out to be a wonderful place for the Chinese Christians from the Bridge Street Church to learn how to serve each other. The church had decided that the hospital should be its project. Members of the congregation worked day after day at the hospital without pay. They cleaned and washed, sang and preached. Hudson could not have been happier than to see the Chinese people he had trained reaching out to others. But they still needed money to run the hospital. Everyone watched eagerly as the money ran out. They wondered if Hudson was right. Would God send more money? The situation became serious. A year and a half earlier, Hudson didn't know if he could support a wife, and now he had a wife, a child, and a hospital to pay for. One afternoon, the cook, who was new convert, came to tell Hudson he had just opened their last bag of rice. At the same moment, the mail arrived. It was a letter from a Mr. Berger in England and a check for £50. If Hudson needed more money, Mr. Berger instructed in his letter he just needed to write and say how much more, and the amount would be sent to him. Hudson read the letter to the cook, who ran yelling down the hallway of the hospital, "God answers prayer! God answers prayer!" In the following months, there were many other wonderful answers to prayer that allowed the hospital to keep on ministering to people's needs. The Bridge Street Church also grew to 21 active members, and there were lots of people who were interested in knowing more about They were interested in knowing more about the gospel. Every afternoon, Hudson taught new converts how to read the Bible and follow its teaching, but every afternoon he found it a little more difficult to concentrate. He did not like to admit it to himself, but he was becoming a very sick man. Well, I put Rosine to sleep. And it's a good reminder, if you're not writing in your prayer journal, writing some prayers, don't forget to do that, to see how God is answering your prayers. Good night.